Hello, Mum. It's Monday, the 3rd of August, and the day after Grandma's birthday. And we thought we would start with a project by reading from Grandma Remembers for you. I hope it's fun. It's a lovely sunny day here. I'm sat in Fergal's room, so I thought I'd start with what Dad wrote in 1994 as he calls it, the editorial preface. So, Janet Boyd, née Wiles, has, for the past 90 years, led a full and active life. That life is full of memories of her exploits, starting in America, currently in Ireland, and spanning the world in between. In 1972, she thought that her grandchildren would like to know something of her family, which, of course, was also their family, and she started to write a series of accounts in a charming form of children's stories of her family and their experiences, always through her eyes. The most recent, A Winter in Paris, was written in 1993, inspired by the fact that Jonathan, Robert's son, and his wife Virginia were living in that city. By this time it was apparent that it was not only her grandchildren who derived the greatest pleasure from these episodes, but also her grown-up children. That's so true. They contain a wealth of family history, and history too, written with understanding and humour, and will appeal to a wider audience. Much yet remains untold, but on the occasion of her 90th birthday, the collection so far has been gathered together in one volume, to be presented to her as she celebrates with 60 of her family and friends. Heartfelt thanks are due to Claire Montel, the wife of Kim, Trevor's third son, whose many hours of painstaking work have helped bring this project to fruition. So, Trevor Boyd, on the occasion of Grandma's 90th birthday, 2nd of August, 1994. So what's that? 26 years ago, as of yesterday. And Kim added a bottom bit, which is important. So, since the words above were written nearly 4 years ago, the manuscript has been edited in detail and original photographs have been placed to illustrate the stories. The lion's share of this work has again been carried out by Claire, who has found the time to do it despite the competing demands of family and her work. Quality of the finished book bears witness to her thorough and professional approach. Hear, hear. Thanks are also due to David Jackson, Kim and Claire's neighbour in London, whose assistance with the photographs is very much appreciated. So we probably read each of us individual chapters, of which I will do next. Good, Mum. So, Chapter 1, The Story of Grace. Grace Lansingh Wiles, 1868 to 1955, in Grandma's own words. Although this story begins like a fairy tale, it is not one. It is a story about a real person, and it is as true story as can be written by someone who wasn't there all the time that it was happening. Once upon a time, more than 100 years ago, and far away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean in America, a little girl was born. Her parents called her Grace. They already had a little girl called Blanche, and later there were 2 boys called Dempster and Van Rensselaer. Now, Van Rensselaer sounds a strange and foreign name to us, but in Holland it would sound quite natural. And it was from Holland that little Grace's family had come, ever so many years before, to live in America. Their family name was Van Rensselaer, as ours is Boyd. Grace's daddy and mummy called her Gracie, and they were all very happy together in their house in a town called Albany, in New York State. But as she got older, there was one thing that Grace was not happy about, and that thing made her different from other children. She wasn't allowed to go to school because of her parents thought she wasn't well and strong enough to go, and so poor Gracie didn't know how to read. This, she decided, she would learn to do all by herself, quietly and secretly, so that no one would know. She knew that words were made of letters, some of only a few letters, some of many, and she knew the names of these letters, and she thought that if she said the letters in the words quickly enough, she would be reading. So she spread a newspaper on the floor and began to say all the letters quickly, one after another, over and over, faster and faster. It didn't sound like reading. She tried it another day and yet another, without success. And just when she was getting really discouraged, someone in the family, I don't know who, but I think it was Blanche, discovered what she was doing, and from that day her mummy began teaching her to read. This pleased Gracie very much and made her feel less stupid in front of her friends. But years later, When she was grown up, she knew she was a bad reader and would always be a slow reader because she had got the habit of forming each letter with her lips. So that later, when she knew how to read, she continually formed each letter with her lips, even when reading to herself. A few years after this, although Grace still did not go to school, her daddy arranged with a friend of his called Mr. Wiles, that she would go to his house on certain days of the week to have German lessons with Mr. Wiles' two little girls, Mabel and Bertha, from their German governess. Grace enjoyed this because she liked being with Mabel and Bertha, but it's doubtful if she learnt much German. When she was 11, everything changed for Grace and her family quite suddenly, as it seemed to the children. All except Dempster had to leave their home and their mummy and daddy and go away to live with aunts and uncles. It wasn't really sudden at all, but carefully planned because their mummy became too ill to look after them all and knew that she could not live long. Blanche and Grace were put on a train by their daddy and travelled for several days and several nights right across the wide land of America till they came to San Francisco, on the shore of the Pacific Ocean. Here they were met by Uncle Clancy and Auntie Lizzie. Dempster, who took them home to their house, where there were 5 boys, all older than Grace, except Roy, who was a little younger. Grace was happy with Aunt Lizzie and Uncle Clancy, and became a regular tomboy, playing with her 5 cousins. Their favourite game was tree tig, which they called tag. When they swung from branch to branch and from tree to tree very dangerously, but with never a bad fall or a broken bone. Another sport was sliding on trays down greasy hills in summer. It had to be in summer because in that part of the country where it rains only in winter, the grass gets so dry in summer that it is almost as slippery as icy snow. Not long after she went to live in San Francisco, Grace's mummy died. And Blanche, who was now a big girl of about 15, went to live with her daddy and Dempster, not in Albany, but in the city of Chicago, lying between Albany and San Francisco. Grace was probably sad to have her sister go away, but if so, we know nothing about it. Aunt Lizzie had arranged for her to take piano lessons with Miss Kellogg, and soon Miss Kellogg's younger sister, Gertrude, became Grace's best friend. They remained fast friends all their lives, and if they could have peeped into the future, they would have seen that Grace's daughter and Gertrude's daughter would have also become good friends. It must not be thought that Grace never went to school. She had started before she left Albany and went to school just like other children in San Francisco. I'll stop there for a moment. So I'm sat in Fergal's room looking out the window, and it's a beautiful sunny day, lots of fluffy clouds, nice sunshine, and I'm watching all of the dragonflies flitting around, and there are three of them, and I guess they're all hunting. Large beasties they are. Anyway, there's lots to see, and traffic going by, so that's the background noise. Right, I'll carry on. So tough time for Grace, poor old Grace Lansingh. She's had lots going on in her life. The time came when Grace was thought to be old enough to go live with her daddy and Blanche in Chicago. So when she was about 16, and this is a guess, we don't really know, and had finished school, she had to say goodbye to Uncle Clancy and Aunt Lizzie and the boys and Gertrude. She was sad to be leaving them, for she loved them all, and they were all sad at losing their Gracie. In Chicago, for the second time, a new kind of life began for Grace. Now she was a young lady and did grown-up things with her big sister, like going to the theatre and to dances. Once Blanche was invited to a big dance to which Grace was longing to go. Since she hadn't been asked, she dressed up like a maid and went with Blanche, and spent the evening with the other maids upstairs, peeping over the banisters to catch glimpses of the dancers below. In those days, a young lady who was old enough to go to dances without a chaperone took her maid with her. She was always ready for a bit of fun and a joke. And one April Fool evening, Grace's father brought home a box of luscious-looking chocolates. He passed them first to Grace, who took one. As she bit through its smooth brown outside, and as something very sharp burnt her tongue, she remembered what day it was. She took a good bite, holding her breath as the powdered ginger scalded her. "Delicious, father," she managed to say. "Try one yourself." And as she held out the box, she pretended to eat the rest of the chocolate. Thinking the shop must have sold him the wrong box, he took one and popped it into his mouth. Next moment he was spluttering, coughing and sneezing as the tears ran down his face. "April Fool!" shouted Grace and Blanche. Soon Grace was happy in Chicago, and it was good to live once more with her daddy and sister. Poor Dempster had died when he was 14, and Rensselaer had stayed with Aunt Mally near New York and was still at school there. Neither Grace nor Blanche was content, however, not to be doing something more interesting and useful than to be a gay young lady. So Blanche went away to university, and after she had graduated and come back to keep the house for their father, Grace went into St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago to train as a nurse. In those days it was not considered proper for a young lady to do such a thing, although a few young ladies, following Florence Nightingale's great example, were doing it. So Grace's daddy made her promise that, if he let her study nursing, she would not afterwards go on being a nurse, but would come home again to be a lady, whatever that is. It was a hard life, much harder in a way than now, since nurses in training had to do heavy work, like scrubbing floors, and had to live under the matron's far stricter discipline. Nonetheless, the young nurses had good times together, and Grace made at least 3 lifelong friends among them. One of these, called Ellen, when she heard many years later of Grace's death, wrote to Grace's daughter, Grandma, telling her what a very kind friend Grace had been to her. She said that only Grace knew that Ellen was the only one of her group of friends who had no pocket money, and that when it was Ellen's turn to go out and buy snacks for the others in the evening, Grace would put her arm in Ellen's and say, "We're going to go shopping together," and Grace would, of course, pay for what Ellen brought back. Their father was very proud of both his daughters, of Blanche because she had graduated from university, and of Grace because she became a state-registered nurse. She had not forgotten the promise she had made to him not to go on nursing, but she had to ask him to let her break that promise a little bit. When war broke out in 1898 between the USA and Spain over an island called Cuba, Grace felt that she should join the American Army as a nurse to care for the wounded soldiers. So her daddy said she might go, and away she went to an army hospital in Florida. She's also already very well travelled. She was disappointed that the war ended before she ever got to Cuba, where the fighting was. Now, one of the most important events of Grace's life was beginning to take place. To understand it, we must look back to what she used to do during the holidays while she was living in Chicago. Frequently she was invited by Mr. Wiles to come and stay with him and Mabel and Bertha, who were now, of course, young ladies too. She used to go with them to the seashore to Havisham House in Rhode Island, where Mr. and Mrs. Gavitt took summer boarders. They had such happy times there, bathing and blueberrying and going for picnics, that Mr. Wiles decided to buy Havisham House to have for his family's summer home. One day, when they were bathing, Mr. Wiles was very nearly dragged out to sea by the strong undertow, and would probably have been drowned if it had not been for Grace's courage and level-headedness. Mabel and Bertha's mummy was now dead, and gradually their daddy came to love Grace more and more, and to want her for his wife. While she was in the army camp in Florida, he went there by train, a long journey of several days and nights, to ask her to marry him. It wasn't the first time he had asked her, but this time she said yes. It'd be pleasant to say that they were married and lived happily ever after, but poor Grace almost didn't live at all. After she got home from the army, she became very ill with typhoid fever, which she'd caught in camp. It was a dangerous disease from which people in those days often died, since there was no injections against it. But she was well nursed at St. Luke's, and her long, thick hair was cut off as short as possible, close to the scalp, which was the usual thing to do with people ill with typhoid. After she got well, when the hair began to grow out, her head, to her great joy, was covered with tight curls. After it grew quite long, it was still curly for a while then. Alas, it went straight as before. I'll stop again and have another break. Here we are again. So, a great disappointment for Grace was that, because of being in hospital, she was not able to be at Blanche's wedding, where she should, of course, have been maid of honour. A few months later, however, she was able to marry Mr. Wiles. On that day, he gave her a prayer book and hymn book bound in white leather with gold-edged pages. Inside the prayer book, he wrote, Grace Lansing, April 26th, 1899, T.S.W. They lived in the same house in Albany where Grace had gone for grammar lessons long ago. Mabel and Bertha were very happy about their new mother, who was actually younger than Mabel. I'll just stop you there because I may get something to show you. So the thing I was going to show you was this, I think it's a chocolate pot. And on it says, Grace Lansing Wiles, 1899. Oh, I've just been visited by a wasp after my juice. Oh, it's gone, maybe. And I assume this is a wedding present, maybe from Thomas Wiles. And I know these pots had some significance because Grandma writes about them at some point. Anyway, back to the story. So, now, once again, a new kind of life began for Grace. She was mistress of the house, and she called Mr. Wiles Tom. She remembered some of the furniture and carpets, including the big bronze lamp in the drawing room. Mabel and Bertha didn't live there anymore because Bertha was married, and Mabel had gone to live with her and help with the children. But they often came to visit, and every summer they would all spend some time together at Havisham House. By and by, a little boy was born to Grace and Tom, and they called him Robert. But he was a weak baby who didn't live long. After a few years, a little girl was born who was so tiny that it was difficult to keep her alive long enough for her to start growing bigger. Fortunately, Grace, who was an excellent loving nurse, succeeded very well. The baby was named Janet, thank goodness, and grew up into a healthy big girl. This was a good thing, since another baby boy born after Janet died too, when he was very young, and his name was Thomas. Life went on happily for Grace and Tom and Janet for almost 10 years. They travelled a great deal in Germany, Switzerland, France, Italy and England, until a terrible war called the First World War broke out. Then, like most people, they stayed at home. During these years, Janet, at first a German nurse called Schwester Kathi, Sister Katie, and later a German governess who was called Fraulein, Miss Ferber. This meant that Janet didn't go to school until the war started, when she was 10, and that she spoke German as perfectly as English. The family would have stayed at home in any case, for Tom, who was now an old man, became ill. Grace was not able to nurse him as she would have liked, and she would have been so well able to do, because she herself was very ill too, and often in hospital. Finally, Tom died just after Janet's 12th birthday. Oh, this was very sad for her and Grace, but much harder for Grace, who had to go on bringing up her little girl without Tom to help and advise her. After another 10 years or so, when Janet was grown up and had graduated from university, she and Grace began again to travel abroad. The longest trip they ever took was on a beautiful big ship called the Empress Australia. We know about that, and we'll hear about it in another chapter, which sailed right around the world, when Gertrude, the daughter of Grace's old friend Gertrude, was with them. On this ship was a young man called Austin Boyd, who was with his parents, whom he called Papa and Mama. Austin and Janet fell in love with each other, and after 2 years they were married in London. Austin brought Janet to live with him in Belfast in a house called Croak's Corner, where a son called Trevor was born to them. Before Trevor was 2 years old, his daddy bought a house at Croak called The Nest. It had a beautiful big garden, but it was a dark and not very pleasant house. So before moving in, Austin and Janet got quite a lot of it knocked down and rebuilt into a much brighter and more convenient house. They changed the name to Skibbereen and lived there for many years, during which time 2 more boys were born, Robert and Kenneth. Now, all this was very happy for Austin and Janet, but what about poor Grace, who was left all alone in faraway America? It was sad for her that her only child should go to live across the ocean in another country. So every summer she came to visit them, first in Croak's Corner, then in Skibbereen. When the babies were born in winter, she came then too. She was a wonderful help to all the family, who soon learned to wait eagerly for her visit each year. She was a remarkably fine granny who loved her grandsons very dearly, but without spoiling them in foolish ways. It wasn't easy for her always to be cheerful and helpful, because she was often ill and often in great pain. Then, all in one year, two things happened which had a big effect on her life. The first to happen was a wonderfully good thing. A clever surgeon in France made her well again, by cutting her open and fixing what was wrong inside and sewing her up again. Just after this, while she was still in France and very weak, the second thing happened. The Second World War started. And once again, most people went home to live in went home to their own countries. But poor Grace was far too weak to travel, and had to wait several months in France while she got stronger. Some day ask Granddaddy and Grandma how she finally got home to America. I'll stop there for another break. Here we go again. So it was a good thing for the family that she did get home, because next year she was able to take Janet and Trevor and Robert and Kenneth into her flat in Washington, where she had lived ever since Janet grew up. They lived there for 2.5 years, away from the danger of bombing near Belfast, where Austin was a welfare officer in the army. Once again, Grace was a wonderful grandmother who took every possible care of her grandsons, sending them to good schools and buying them good clothes. For years, she knitted all their socks and stockings. They liked it in Washington. Grace's flat was on the edge of a wooded glen, through which ran a river called Rock Creek. The glen was called Rock Creek Park, and part of it was the zoo. The gates into the zoo was just next door to the flats. At night, the little boys often heard the lions roaring. Trevor was a weekly boarder at a school, while Robert went to day school. Kenneth was too young to go to school, and during the 3 summers in America she rented a house at the seashore. The first summer on Deer Isle, near her brother Rensselaer. The next 2 summers at Havisham, near Bertha and her children and grandchildren. Grace had a black chauffeur called Caleb, who loved the boys and they loved him. He helped them with boats and fishing and any number of other things that interested them. He also reminded them of their manners, telling them that they were little gentlemen and must behave as such. This meant, among other things, washing their hands before meals. No granny was ever better loved than Grace. It was a sad day for her when, on a cold winter's afternoon, she went with them and their mummy down to the docks in Philadelphia and waved goodbye to them as they stood on the deck of the Serpa Pinto, the Portuguese ship that was to take them through the dangerous Atlantic waters where German submarines were prowling, back to Europe to land at the city of Lisbon in Portugal, from there where they would fly home. Grace was left wondering every day and every night during those weeks that they were on the Serpa Pinto, whether the little family would arrive safely in Lisbon. At last she received the telegram telling her that they were there. But it was 3 weeks before she got another telegram telling her that they were home again at Skibbereen with Austin. Some day ask your daddies to tell you about the long trip home. But then Grandma writes about that too, so that's good. Another break. Grace waited impatiently for the end of the war so that she could again spend summers at Skibbereen. Long last she was able to go, but not by ship, because the ships that had not been sunk during the war were full of soldiers sailing to their homes. She flew across the ocean, an adventurous thing for an old lady to do, and was met by Austin and Janet at Shannon. From that time she never missed a summer in Ireland. One year, when she was able to come again by ship, but when Austin and Janet were not able to meet her either in Liverpool or in Belfast because they were in Scotland, she took an air taxi from Liverpool to Newton Ards. The taxi was a 2-seater plane, and the pilot was Aunt Jessie's nephew. Jessie Boyd was married to Wilson, Granddaddy's elder brother, and she was Trevor's godmother. Another time she went with Austin and Janet and Trevor and Robert to France, where they all stayed at a hotel in Juan-les-Pins. One day when Trevor and Robert went up to her room on the top floor, they found her leaning out of the window, trying to drop cherry stones on the heads of people walking in the street below. Grace always had breakfast on a tray in bed. While she was eating it, or after she had finished, her grandsons used to go to her room to say good morning, and they used to like to stay as long as possible, chatting. She always had something interesting to talk about, as was to be expected of an old lady who dropped cherry stones on people's heads, and who travelled right around the world seeing wonderful places. Moreover, she had been the first member of her family, before Janet and Austin were even married, to travel by plane, when she had flown over from London to Paris and back again. It was during one of these breakfast time visits that Grace taught Kenneth to play patience and to knit. I wonder if he could still knit. He knitted a little scarf for each of his 2 teddies. During these years, Grace's grandsons were, of course, growing up. She was very proud and happy of the day she watched Trevor's graduation ceremony from the balcony of the Whittle Hall at Queen's University. A couple of years after that, she left her flat in Washington the morning after April Fool's Day to board a plane for Belfast. She was going to Ireland earlier than usual that year, so as to be there for Trevor's wedding to Heather Andrews. That's you, Mum. It made her so happy to be going, even though she didn't feel quite well. She couldn't, of course, know that she would never be back in her flat again. At Belfast Airport, which was then at Nuts Corner, she was met by Austin and Janet and Robert and Kenneth, and was soon having dinner at Skibbereen. Her eldest grandson's wedding was a great occasion for Grace, especially since she already loved Heather. It made a splendid ending to her life. This is what it proved to be, for not much more than a fortnight later she died one evening peacefully. This was a time of great sorrow, but all were thankful to have been part of Grace's family, and her many, many friends on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean were glad to have been her friends. Her grandsons loved her dearly and were proud of her, and they called her Croak. So this story of Grace was written in 1972 by Grandma, Grace's daughter Janet, for her grandchildren. And there is a correction that Grandma makes. Grandma has made a bad mistake on the sequence of events. It is stated here that Grace developed typhoid fever after her service in the Spanish-American War, but that was not the case. She developed it after she completed her nurse's training at St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago. It did prevent her participating in her sister Blanche's wedding. And Grandma wrote that the 1st September 1987. And it's full of lovely pictures, but maybe you could have Grandma Remembers open in front of you. Listen, lots of love, Mummy, and I don't know who's going to read the next chapter, but I'll be pleased to come and read another one later. Okay, missing you lots of love. Bye bye.